Good afternoon once again. My name is Erick Riles, and I will be acting as your technical moderator for today's call. Thank you all so very much for joining us, taking some time out of your busy Thursday afternoon. Today's conference is the State of the Industry 2017, Major Disrupting Events and Their Impact on Consulting. A few housekeeping and technical items before I kick it over to your moderator, Erick Burchfield. So you should all be able to see the screen right now, and hopefully you can all hear my voice. The phone lines, however, are muted, so although all of you can hear me, we cannot hear you. That said, you can still ask us questions, and in fact, we encourage you to do so. There is a question-asking panel on the bottom right-hand part of your screen. You can go ahead, open it up, type in a question, and hit submit, and we will get to all questions at the end of today's session. Feel free to submit at any time, but be aware that we're going to have a special section at the end for questions and answers. We are recording today's session, and it will be available for you in the next couple of days, so you'll be able to replay it at your leisure. That said, without further ado, let me turn it over to Erick Burchfield, who will be moderating today's panel discussion. Erick.
Thank you very much, Erick. Good afternoon and welcome to the Consulting State of the Industry webinar. We're thrilled to have your attention for the next hour. My name is Erick Burchfield. I am Managing Director of Research for ALM. This is the first in a series of free webinars we intend to do, assuming it's successful, which we're optimistic about. We have a great turnout. It appears tentatively as though the appetite for more of this exists. So we really, I really want to emphasize that we would be really grateful for any and all feedback you all would be grateful enough to provide, both in the form of questions about what we can be more explicit, more specific about, but also would have been great to hear more about this, less about that, help us refine and hone what we talk about so that it delivers the most potential value to you all. Just a little description of what we do at ALM Intelligence very briefly before we get started. ALM Intelligence as a whole, as a research organization, covers the legal, benefits, and consulting markets. We're obviously going to be very focused on consulting intelligence here today. Our analysts, who you'll hear from, basically spend all of their time talking to consulting leadership and clients, assessing and rating consulting firms, sizing markets, and estimating demand and the underlying demand drivers and characteristics, and gathering data and insights on the consulting marketplace, which you'll hear about today. Next slide, please. I am joined by a number of my excellent colleagues who I'll introduce in a minute, but let me just set the stage very briefly for what we intend to talk about today. So already this year in 2017 and in coming into this year in 2016, we've witnessed some significant macro level political events. And we're going to hone in on two of those and talk about the implications on the provision of consulting, what providers need to do to meet the expectations that accompany these political changes, and what the buy-side response is likely to be. We're going to focus on the U.S. presidential administrative change and the global implications in addition to the U.S. implications of that change and some of the early policies that we've seen from that administration. And we're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about Brexit and both the regional and global implications of that development. We're going to do that by looking through three primary lenses. From an industry standpoint, we're going to focus on some highly regulated industries and some very large industries from a consulting demand standpoint. We expect regulation to be a little less certain, perhaps even be fundamentally changed in ways that we'll talk about. So we'll be focused on the public sector, both in the U.S. and globally, and on its demand for consulting services and on implications for providers who service those customers and clients. We'll be talking about the healthcare industry, and then lastly we'll be talking about the financial services industry. My panelists today include Matt Merker, who is our lead for our consulting industry research. part of his team, Laura Becker, who is also an industry consulting analyst. Our lead for finance management consulting is Tomek Jankowski, and he covers many of the areas that are particularly subject to disruption by virtue of regulatory shifts in areas like banking and risk management. And then to help us sort of translate the underlying thematic things that you'll hear the aforementioned three analysts talk about, Lasse Pitkaeniemi is our Director of Market Research, leads our database products, and is really our quant guy, and helps to basically translate what we find into a database of consulting cut any number of ways, and he's going to talk a little bit about overarching takeaways from these two macro events that I've just discussed. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn things over to Lasse now, and we're going to lead with the punchline. It's just kind of how we see demand in the U.S. and globally for consulting over the next few years, and Lasse will talk a little bit about what's beneath the numbers here, and we'll obviously do more of that as we go on into the presentation. Lasse?
Thank you, Eric. So this image depicts the U.S. consulting market as was analyzed in the Global Consulting 2016 North America report. As you all know, the consulting market is a big, mature, and robust industry, especially in the United States. And political change is one of the macro factors that always affects our industry as well as the underlying economy. So what has changed? Compared with our U.S. forecast we released in the Global Consulting 2016 North America report, the CAGR has been revised upwards by 1 percentage point due to the expected and ongoing change in the U.S. tax, trade, and regulatory policies. Next slide, please. In terms of the geopolitical and macroeconomic events, it seems to be that we are entering a world where the big surprises are no longer limited to the developing countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Instead, we're starting to see actual surprises in the mature European and North American markets, and based on the ongoing trend, we are expecting to see more of them. After the US, the changes in the European consulting market have most affected our global consulting forecast. And this is something we already wrote about in the Global Consulting 2016 EMEA report. But unlike 2 months ago when that report was released, we're now seeing the first real steps being taken towards a real Brexit and an escalation of political instability in the EU at large. So how is this forecast different? We are expecting an increase in global consulting growth corresponding to a higher CAGR by a little bit more than a half a percentage point, largely due to supply chain disruptions, monetary policy, and an increased risk environment. And back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Lasse. Appreciate that. And so to help provide a little bit more context around that, I'm going to now segue to one of my colleagues, and we'll basically follow a sequence that looks at the public sector implications, the healthcare implications, and then the financial services implications. My colleagues will hand off between one another, and then in between sections come back to me. I'm going to start with my colleague Matt Merker. Matt's background includes time at Booz Allen Hamilton. He's got great perspective on the U.S. public sector, which is an area that's been under a lot of scrutiny from the standpoint of what it will spend on and what its priorities will be. And to help us understand what all that means from a consulting standpoint, I'm going to turn things over to Matt for the next slide.
Thanks, Eric. And as Eric mentioned, now that we've gone over the quantitative analysis piece, I'll be kicking us off with some thoughts on the impact of the Trump administration, both on the aerospace and defense industry as well as the public sector overall. So first on aerospace and defense, which kind of finds itself in a contradictory position at this point compared to a traditional Republican administration. While a Republican administration is traditionally a good sign for the Lockheeds, the Northrops, and the Boeings of the world, there are still challenges, particularly under President Trump. His recent comments, an example of which you can see on the right of your screen, demonstrate that these companies are generally not going to receive a blank check, as Trump prides himself on making deals and making that one of his campaign promises. And that is clearly extending to the A&D industry if his comments pre-inauguration continue now that he has been received as president. So his comments on Lockheed's F-35 and Boeing's Air Force One, among others, places pressure on defense contractors whose contracts with the U.S. federal government often exceed budgets and schedules. These companies will find themselves with increased onus on finding cost savings to their bottom line for contracts with the U.S. federal government. And in that search, we think that consultants are going to find a niche within these companies to find organizational and manpower efficiencies. There's going to be a growing directive within these larger defense engineering firms to find these organizational efficiencies, to find these manpower efficiencies in order to reduce bottom line. Utilizing analytics and new technologies to reduce operating costs, these companies can lower their bidding costs for government contracts but still reap significant profit. And while the Trump administration may be placing more scrutiny on their spending, there's still significant opportunity for these sorts of companies regardless, as the President has stated repeatedly during his campaign and beyond, that he wishes to modernize the military. So moving on to the public sector overall, obviously the aerospace and defense industry is a private sector entity, but definitely has interactions with the U.S. public sector. Within the U.S. public sector, change management will remain a steady source of revenue for consultancies. President Trump has indicated his desire to dramatically reduce certain departments such as commerce and energy, necessitating organizational design and strategic planning to effectively transition to a leaner operating model. Also, identifying areas that can be cut completely from these types of departments will be a priority, and objective consultative support will be the most effective in that determination. And traditionally, as clients tell us within the government and the reason that they reach out to the private consultancies, there is, a bit of pride and ownership of organizations, especially when you have leadership that has been present for decades, and identifying areas that need to be cut and even more difficult people that could be cut is a difficult process internally, especially for long-standing U.S. federal clients. So the need for that outside consultative support will continue to rear its head into the future, particularly for commerce and energy and a few other departments that are seeking to cut. So fortunately for several of the larger firms involved in the U.S. public sector, such as Booz Allen Hamilton, Deloitte, PwC, there are already strong legacy capabilities in place. Booz Allen, for example, commits to change management advanced practitioner programs to really drive home the need to have that ability within the federal space. All that said, while some of the federal departments will see cuts, the opposite is true for areas such as the Department of Defense and Homeland Security, which more than likely see funding increases. That said, having undergone significant cuts over the past 8 years in the previous administration, particularly for the Department of Defense, leadership within the department will be shrewd in its decision-making on growth areas, ensuring that that growth is measured and sustainable and able to weather any sudden shifts in funding that could cause undue burden on any one particular agency within the department. So this will require, this is where the strat planning side of consultancy is going to really come into play. Clients are going to want to have a strat plan that demonstrates a long-term growth strategy that is defensible both to Congress and the administration in case any sort of review comes along the way, and it certainly will throughout the course of the administration's term. And finally, just one last point, all that said, as far as the contracting practices of the federal government, we suspect that lowest price technically acceptable will continue to be the go-to criteria, as keeping costs down has been a campaign promise, and it's not looking like that's going to change much from the previous administration. Best value will still exist in some places, but LTCA is still going to be king in most areas. And with that, I'm going to pass you along to my colleague Laura to talk about how the President Trump is going to impact the healthcare industry in the United States. Laura.
Thank you, Matt. There's so much to discuss here, and there's been so much conversation. No one's really quite sure exactly how healthcare will look under the Trump administration. But one thing we do know, after speaking to a lot of consultants that we've been briefing, is that everyone seems to think that the current course will not change significantly. The shift toward value-based care through reducing costs and focusing on quality outcomes is at a tipping point for their clients. These things have been baked in over the last 6 years, and there's just no turning back regardless of any Trump changes. We'll continue to see increasing consulting demand in 4 major service lines, including strategy and operations, digital, analytics, and regulatory consulting, as the industry continues on its current path toward a patient-centric approach through consumer engagement. Let's talk about S&O and digital first. A first line of attack for consultants will be the development of digital, social media, and collaborative strategies to move the needle to better engage consumers and build brand loyalty. Consumerism in healthcare will thrive due to increased consumer choices because of health savings accounts, which will surge under Trump. The consultant's toolbox to engage consumers will include things like online appointment scheduling, remote monitoring devices, and everything in between. The data collected will be used to develop customized approaches. As you can see in the graphic on the right of the slide, each player in the industry will need digital strategies to ensure successful execution. In fact, new market entrants like telehealth companies American Well and Teladoc were among the most funded on-demand companies in 2016. American Well just did a survey finding that 1 in 5 consumers would switch doctors to those that offer video visits. That translates into 50 million consumers. We've heard consultants describe new market entrants such as American Well as companies that are unpacking the healthcare value chain. That means delivering care in new and exciting ways. Some of the larger consulting firms are really capturing a demand here, particularly PwC with its Customer Experience Center, and others like it that are creating these types of experimental sandboxes. A consultant told us an interesting anecdote about some work he was doing with a payer client. The client came to him and said that they think they needed an app. The consultant asked why, and the answer was kind of just because everyone's doing it. The consultant responded that if they really wanted to differentiate, they had to do something real. The example he gave was of when a customer loses a prescription on vacation and you can quickly get a replacement into the palm of their hand. That's how to make a difference and how to make things real. And those will be customer differentiators as we move forward. Second, let's talk about analytics consulting. Consultants will help to develop an analytics infrastructure for their clients to support and assess all of this newfound digital data. More sophisticated, larger companies will build in-house analytics platforms, while others will look to consultants for co-sourcing or managed services options. Something interesting to watch among consulting firms in the analytics arena is the emergence of what we refer to as consultants who are transition value optimizers. These may be mid-tier firms that have found a real niche and specialize in analytics-driven research. A firm like the Advisory Board Company, for example, has tremendous depth and expertise in transitioning healthcare companies to the new environment and has made some key acquisitions to further deepen their bench. Third, let's talk about regulatory. In the regulatory arena, clients will need help in navigating and interpreting all regulatory and benefits changes, which may include the Cadillac tax or lack thereof, across state border insurance opportunities, or employer-sponsored private insurance exchanges. As providers and payers fear losing patients with the loss of the individual mandate, advisory will be needed to find ways to compensate for any lost revenue. And Tomek, I think we should move on to you and financial services.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for the introduction, and welcome everyone today. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I just want to hit on a few important nail heads on this slide here. First off, a big focus for now is going to be around helping banking clients merely tread water, keeping the lights on until it becomes clear what is going to happen. Existing projects are moving forward, but there seems to be a hold on new ones, especially larger scale projects. To that point, anecdotally, my team and I have heard from several client-side contacts the banks are holding their breath. That's an expression I've heard a few times. Holding back on any major projects until the future becomes clear. But as one very frustrated sell-side contact wondered anxiously, what will be the trigger event that convinces banks to start spending again? The truth is, of course, that in politics and markets, dust never truly settles. So how long can banks hold their breath before reacting to change? A second important point is that for all the talk about rolling back regulations, a positive thing in bankers' eyes, nevertheless, U.S. banks now are essentially built and molded around Dodd-Frank. So any strategic change, even a positive one in reaction to reduce regulatory burdens, is going to require significant structural change in terms of compliance, operations, talent, change management, delivery channels, etc. It's an opportunity for important strategic change, but that change comes with a cost. It's like removing a wooden splinter. There's no painless way out of it. That presents some great opportunities for consultants to once again spring to action, just as in 2009 and 2010, and help banks move in the direction they want. But the reality of banking budgets and the discretionary nature of projects, the non-discretionary nature of projects rather, means consulting firms are going to have to deliver with very competitive rates. This will be the primary challenge for consultants in the years ahead, being able to work on complex client problems, often requiring highly specialized knowledge and resources, but under strong rate pressures. And again, anecdotally, there's another challenge for consultants. These political shifts come on the heels of another phenomenon that was already having an impact before the Brexit, or the U.S. presidential elections. Over the past years, my team and I have been speaking with the senior leadership of many banks, and quite frankly across industries, several industries. The clear message that has been filtering up is of a desire to develop more capabilities in-house and use consulting services on a more tactical level, eschewing the larger transformation-style projects. They like the broad end-to-end capabilities of the larger, more developed consulting firms, but seemingly want to cherry-pick these firms' highly specialized skills and capabilities, rather like a buffet, rather than turning everything over to the firms. A consistent message has been that they, the banks, need to be more strategic in their use of consultants, utilizing them in-house, where in-house expertise or capabilities just aren't up to it, but otherwise relying on the in-house resources whenever possible. This trend, coupled with the uncertainty of our current political and market environment, again, translates into some important fee and relationship challenges for banks. A final point I wanted to share with you is a thought about how consultants are going to be delivering services for banks going forward and what their focus should be. The balance of power politically is shifting from the global model to a more localized model. Global banks and companies are not going away, but political trends increasingly favor the local over the global, and those political forces are going to put pressure on corporations to comply through legislation and new policies. Consulting firms are going to have to help banking clients, the spear point of globalization, to pivot towards a more local model of both production and delivery. But the consulting firms themselves, as echoes and products of the huge transformations that have shaken the financial world since 2007, must also adapt to this new environment. The global corporate model is not going away, but the world seemingly is becoming less appreciative of the benefits of economies of scale, and the model is going to be forcefully modified by local political forces, whether we like it or not. Consulting firms need to be the first to make the painful shifts in their own structures and service delivery at cost, and then lead the way for banking clients. I'll end here with an observation that in some respects the rollback in regulations is going to be particularly a challenge for smaller consulting firms who are focused on GRC consulting and related services, but this pivot towards the local over the global may provide a countervailing opportunity for these smaller firms with highly specialized services but low overhead as we go ahead. With that, let me turn things back over to Eric.
Thank you, Tomek. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the second somewhat unexpected political development and its implications on the consulting marketplace, and that is Brexit, which, while somewhat further in our rear view, not unlike the administrative change here in the U.S., we expect to have some pretty profound implications on consulting demand writ large, and particularly in some of these highly regulated and particularly globalized sectors that we're talking about today: financial services, public sector, and healthcare. So to start things off, I'm going to turn back to Matt Merker, our public sector specialist, to talk a little bit about how Brexit will impact public sector consulting demand and supply.
Thanks, Eric. And as Eric mentioned, I'll just touch briefly on some of the high-level public sector implications for the Brexit and what consultants can expect to see as far as opportunity in this year and next. As we all know, Brexit has many implications behind its enactment, and there's a lot of work to be done to make the separation of the UK from the EU actually take place. From a business angle, there is much that will need to change, as Tomek will undoubtedly touch on, as well as Laura in the healthcare space. Within the public sector, though, much will need to change as well. The integration of UK government functions and the interplay therein with the EU is long-standing, and separating those two will necessitate significant change management consulting, a similar theme that we are seeing across the board as we go through these several pillars that we see impacting this year and next. The old skills that the UK government is not accustomed to handling on its own, such as negotiating trade deals, will require a fast catch-up for the UK government as far as capability. Clients within the UK government that we've spoken to have mentioned the concern of the quote-unquote capability gap for areas like negotiating trade deals and other day-to-day type operations that were increasingly outsourced to the EU that will now need to come back, albeit slowly. Fixing this capability gap will require the stand-up of new organizations and entities within the government, and to that end, human capital strategy is going to be very key in this area, identifying resources that can hit the ground running operating within the UK government, preparing to manage those new responsibilities, while also metering out the legacy functionality that remains with the EU during the separation process. One thing that we can say about the UK with its legacy history of interaction with the EU, that their communication strategy capabilities and also their in-house liaison type capabilities are very strong, and they're going to be brought to bear throughout this entire process. And I think consultancies, in a large part, while helping with that somewhat, that that capability is really well developed within the UK government as far as communications capability goes. So it's really going to have to do a lot with strat planning and stand-up of new organizations. The UK's spending habits as a result of Brexit are also becoming more conservative, focusing on efficiencies and savings versus a strict focus on innovation. And this is not unlike the US government spending focus after the recession in 2008. Anticipating the need for a lean organization, the UK government is looking to get ahead of the curve in its spending and organizational costs. And to that end, outside consultative support, once again, will be key in providing shrewd assessments of operations, recommending cuts where possible, and also identifying the cost of new organizations that will be necessary once the separation is complete. So that said, firms with a strong financial management capability as well as a global presence, such as the big four firms, PwC, the Deloitte, KPMG, and EY, will have advantage in this realm. So that's just a high-level view of where we see the public sector going in the UK from Brexit. But I do want to stress again that I think parallels between how the US government spent on consulting during the early stages of the recession in 2008 and how the UK is approaching it now is a good blueprint to predict where the opportunities for consultants will be and what public sector UK clients are going to be spending their money on. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Laura to speak on some of the healthcare impacts for Brexit.
Yes, thanks so much, Matt. In healthcare, we think that there are 3 areas in particular that we will actually see an increased demand for consulting because of Brexit, and those include human resources, regulatory, and strategy and operations. We can start with number 1, human resources consulting. Consultants will need to get involved with human capital recruitment and workforce training programs in an effort to replace anticipated talent gaps due to the pushback on immigration. By some accounts, EU nationals make up close to 10% or 130,000 individuals of the current NHS workforce. This will obviously pose significant labor shortages that will need to be quickly addressed. One consulting firm that stands out for its work here is PA Consulting, which is based in the UK. PA has been working on NHS workforce issues for some time, and they have a history of working with the government on social care initiatives to improve care for an aging population. Much of this work is focused on telehealth provision to reach a less agile elderly population. These efforts should actually continue to be very helpful for a talent-strapped NHS moving forward. Number 2, we can look at regulatory consulting. And consultants will be enlisted to devise new strategies and direction for the NHS and for pharmas, given the impact of a possible relocation of the European Medical Agency, which is akin to the US's FDA. An EMA relocation could result in more regulatory hurdles for drugs to get through. For instance, in the future, there may be 2 regulatory hurdles in the UK, both the EMA and a newly formed UK regulator, before drugs can actually reach patients. This could mean higher prices and drug delays. Consultants will be working to address the regulatory impacts and work with pharmas to keep drug prices and regulatory hurdles as manageable as possible with limited delays. This will require significant collaboration with regulatory bodies as well as streamlined business processes. In terms of tax inversions, which have become very popular of late, tax and strategy consultants will be evaluating and advising on the best moves in a changing environment. U.S. farmers that have joined EU companies may even face potential tax increases. The financial impact will need to be addressed by consultants. And now on to our 3rd area, S&O advisory, which we think will see a real spike. If these changes do impact the NHS as predicted, there will be a rise in private healthcare in the UK and medical tourism. A US-UK trade deal could encourage US companies to get into the fray and enter the private market in the UK. If in fact this does come to fruition, foreign companies will seek advisory to gain access to the UK healthcare market, either going it alone or seeking M&A and other partnership opportunities. I was speaking with a consultant who has done a lot of work with medical tourism in the Middle East, bringing in doctors from the Cleveland Clinic and others, and he was struck by the fact that now, all of a sudden, the possibility of people flying into London for private treatment becomes a greater likelihood, particularly in light of a weaker sterling, which provides for attractive investment opportunities from foreign companies. So lots of exciting opportunities in the UK private healthcare sector looking forward. And Tomek, it is your turn to discuss financial services, please.
Thanks, Laura. To start off on a positive note, as it seems likely the U.S. will be rolling back its own regulations to some degree in the near future, the Brexit, I think, provides some cover for consulting firms currently more focused on the U.S. GRC market to consider a shift towards Europe. After the 2009 economic crisis, almost all consulting firms, but especially those with a strong auditing heritage, made strong investments in their financial services, compliance, and risk practices. And those services paid off handsomely, forming until recently a huge portion of the consulting revenues. Many expanded this approach seamlessly into other highly regulated U.S. sectors such as healthcare and energy, but now those revenues are in danger under the new U.S. administration. So it may be that the Brexit and all its legislative and bureaucratic messiness may throw some consultants a lifeline. Those firms able to pivot their focus and resources towards European banking and other clients may be able to maintain strong utilization rates and revenues. The Big Four obviously will have little challenge in making this shift. In fact, they're pretty much positioned for it anyway. But in recent years, other U.S.-based consulting firms, which traditionally focused on middle-tier clients, have been developing and investing in larger European client needs. Firms such as North Highland, West Monroe Partners, FTI Consulting, Protiviti, these firms will likely be better able to weather a U.S. consulting market slowdown in this space for the longer term. Next, a big part of the post-Brexit opportunity for consultants and where the heavy lifting is going to be will be around helping London and UK-based banks re-rationalize their delivery models. UK and European banking models will fundamentally be impacted, and there will be a great need to rethink the deployment of people, investments, and other resources to suit an eventual final Brexit agreement. There'll be an initial quick pivot, of course, with a focus on minimal disruption to services, followed by years of rebuilding IT, operational, process, and talent resource structures. An important point is that while this process will be long and drawn out, this isn't the future. At least 3 London-based banks have reacted to Prime Minister May's recent announcement about a hard Brexit by starting to move units and people out of London now. This is happening right now. And this underscores a final point, which is that the Brexit is actually going to be a long, multi-year process full of unpredictable zigs and zags. The British government itself is looking out as far as 2021. Consultants need to be focused on helping banking clients formulate contingency plans with scenarios for all eventual outcomes. Most are already doing this, of course, but to a surprising degree, we still hear banks taking a wait-and-see approach. But this isn't the only danger in our current situation. As consultants help banks develop contingency plans, the worst-case scenario should not be dismissed. Over the past several months, as we've spoken with senior consulting leaders and partners, a common thread in my teams and our discussions about the Brexit has been that while there will be no doubt some disruption, that it's in all parties' interests to ultimately find some sort of reasonable accommodation. That is the expectation. But as the events earlier this week showed here in the U.S., there are new and unpredictable political forces at work. On Monday, Amazon and Google unexpectedly found themselves scrambling to get employees abroad back into the U.S. So consultants need to take seriously in their contingency planning work with clients the potential for worst-case scenarios becoming a reality. This is the world we live in. And finally, like the old commercial, consultants won't just be spokesmen for the services. They, too, will be their own clients as they are forced to take their own medicine alongside. So with that, let me turn things back to Erick.
Thank you, Tomek. We're going to transition to a conversation a little bit about, before we preview another lens we use, another way of looking at the market, which is to look at a particular service area in IT. Before we do that, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking big picture about some of the underlying destabilizing macroeconomic environment that's driving a lot of this consulting change. But to start that conversation, I'm going to turn things back over to Matt.
Thanks, Erick. And the issue that I'd like to touch on from the public sector angle is the migration crisis in Europe, which continues to create challenges for the EU and highlights the differences among member countries, especially in asylum practices and immigration policy. From an organizational perspective, the disparity among member countries is creating disproportional burden upon certain members and creating refugee crises in areas of high population. And organizationally, public sector consultants will be useful in finding ways to streamline that refugee processing in problem areas, as well as strategies for tracking and monitoring those refugees, providing an accurate snapshot of the population in a given country. The IT angle here will be particularly resonant with analytics capabilities crucial to driving decision-making. So where we've talked a lot about change management with the Brexit and with the Trump administration having the biggest impact, I think the IT consulting angle is going to find a lot of traction here, especially with security concerns, and then also through the operations process. Within the EU governance structure, providing objective analysis of the viability of sustained migration support due to the crisis in the Middle East will be of value from a policy analysis perspective as well. So there's definitely going to be some non-IT, some soft skill policy analysis that's definitely going to be well received by clients, especially because for many of the government clients, this is unfamiliar terrain. This is an area where you have an unprecedented event occurring and ongoing, and they're still looking for ways to best manage it. Security policy consulting will also continue to have traction in the EU as member countries still struggle with handling the migration crisis as well as the continued threat of ISIS. Innovative thinking will be key in maintaining a robust security apparatus that both manages the influx of migrants while protecting these countries' citizens from terrorist threats. Consultants with backgrounds in national and transnational security issues will be of particular interest to government officials within the EU member countries' defense apparatuses. The sorts of firms that will be well positioned for that work are those with a dedicated public sector practice as well as a global presence. That said, though, there is going to be increasing interest also in security-based firms. And we do see a lot of partnership among some of the larger firms working with the smaller security-based firms. I know that we have several independent consultancies that are U.S.-based here. There is opportunity, especially for penetrating into the European market for this particular issue. But I think one of the best ways to go about that is through partnership with some of the larger global firms that already have a well-established presence in the public sector of these EU member countries. And arguably because of this migration crisis as a large starting point, the rise of populist movements in several EU member countries also provides opportunities for consultants from a business perspective. And understanding the proposed business policies these potential new administrations will undertake if they work to power, consultants can provide strategic guidance to the private sector to prepare them for that scenario and thus minimize financial and operational disruption if there were any to occur. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tomek to talk a little bit more about the financial services and financial consulting. We're actually going to remain on that slide for a moment, Eric. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And I'll just make two important points here. With those populist political movements that Matt just referenced around the world rejecting post-2009 austerity measures in favor of more aggressive economic growth models, there's likely to be an increased danger of inflation, possibly rising interest rates. That's certainly happening here in the U.S. And either we don't know what the administration is going to do in terms of its policy towards the dollar. So there are a lot of important variables to consider. Higher interest rates may be positive for banks in the short run, and they may rein in what some see as artificially inflated credit markets, but the result will be big challenges to corporate finance departments. And furthermore, this all means that global arbitrage is going to become much more difficult in the coming years, posing serious balance sheet and finance strategy challenges for corporations and consultants alike. This is going to be a big opportunity for consulting firms working in that back office and the middle office, particularly as banks, for instance. They're going to be taking a hit with the slowdown in currency arbitrage, as currency desks have been a huge, big profit center for these banks in the last half decade or so. So the other point I'll just make very quickly is that economic nationalism, again, Matt referenced it. This basically means that both for banks, for most global corporations, and for consulting firms themselves, which are global corporations, many of them, moving people, investments, data, and resources across borders is going to become much more difficult in the years ahead. This is going to be a primary challenge for those firms. That said, Eric, over to you again.
Thank you very much, Tomek. Now, obviously, many of the things that we've talked about today so far are going to affect a number of different functional areas of consulting strategy. Both Tomek and Matt talked about some of the human capital, manpower constraints and resource constraints that immigration reform or could create in addition to the other factors they described. Our primary lens for this webinar has been to look at things through industry. We wanted to spend a little bit of time offering a deep dive on one functional area that I think is particularly germane to this conversation and is obviously a particularly kind of hot part of the stove from a supply and demand standpoint. Our champ to do that is not our IT consulting lead, but Laura Becker will be handling that conversation. I'm thrilled that she'll be doing that. Laura, I'm going to turn things over to you for the next couple slides.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, there's just no way we could overlook the impact of IoT and digital transformation in healthcare industry, which is what we're going to discuss first. And by virtue of the fact that there's so many new digital inputs, the inherent risk that it creates as well. So Overall, we see that we will continue to see a continued surge in IoT and cybersecurity consulting spend in the healthcare industry. And we can first talk about IoT initially. Consultants will work with new market entrants such as technology and telecommunications firms, as well as traditional players, to create strategies around IoT integration, sound design, and implementation, as well as a special focus on embedding security layers into devices. Healthcare, as you probably know, is one of the fastest growing industries for IoT devices, from EHRs to blockchain technology and everything in between, in addition to a new push to share data for insights. So all of these data connections create great promise, but also inherent risks, as can be seen in the graphic to the right of the slide here with all of the additional IoT and digital inputs. Each of these new cybersecurity risks and threats need to be anticipated proactively. Consulting focus is needed to address issues around strategies, processes, governance, which is highly important, across the healthcare ecosystem as accountability is gaining heightened attention. As many buy-side clients have told us, their boards and their audit committees are now taking notice of this issue. We're hearing that consultants have become a form of middleware, building relationships within organizations and helping to explain subject matter and bridge gaps between the board, IT, and other members across the organization. To make matters worse, providers, really all of them, other than the largest systems, are not accustomed to dealing with and managing IT and technology, and they are now responsible for ensuring patient safety. For example, they're even responsible for when an insulin pump gets hacked. There's huge liability and concern over these issues. Consultants will be engaged to help to secure assets and, very importantly, to provide an extra set of eyes and to provide air cover, as we've heard it described by some consultants. Traditionally, regulations and compliance dictate consulting demand to some extent, but now compliance is not enough. In the Trump era, some regulation may even be lifted, but the threat of cyber attacks continues to increase in a world of IoT. Some interesting consulting firms to watch in this arena are those that focus exclusively on the healthcare industry and cybersecurity, such as Coalfire. Some of these firms are high-trust certified, which can be an advantage because, as a buy-side client described, their ability to provide both the HIPAA compliance and the strategy and risk assessments creates significant efficiencies. Consulting demand is very high here. Several clients have told us that even when they get RFPs, they're not being responded to. Consultants just don't even have the time to respond. Talent gaps are also a serious issue. In many organizations, particularly small and medium-sized providers, there is still no chief security officer, and security concerns are left to an understaffed IT department or a CIO. Consultants are working with clients to ensure that the cybersecurity strategy goes across functions from the top down, with a governance infrastructure and workforce training to go with it, even providing interim staffing when necessary. There is an understanding on the buy side that consulting firms may be increasing their fees here as demand increases. One buy-side client told us that there is definitely a premium on pricing with not enough talent anywhere. So overall, that is good news for consultants. So that talks a little bit about what's going on in the healthcare industry with IoT and cybersecurity. And should we just move on now to the manufacturing industry to address IoT? Laura. Okay, terrific. So again, in manufacturing, we think that the impact of IoT and cybersecurity consulting is going to be significant with a spike in consulting demand. Consultants are working with clients to gain competitive advantage by differentiating offerings with IoT. Manufacturing is going through some unbelievable shifts towards smarter, customized product and service outcomes. Examples of smarter outcomes might be tires with sensors that inform consumers of reliability and durability, or food packaging that you might pick up and see a safety feature that can indicate when the food is spoiled or expired. Consulting firms will be engaged to integrate all of these digitally enabled technologies, including sensors, robotics, 3D printing, for example, that are all being used to rethink production and how to go to market in a more competitive environment with more demanding customers. Consulting engagements will encompass IoT strategies and work to enhance and streamline business processes all along the supply chain. In fact, consultants are building up their own practices to ensure strong expertise in these areas. For example, EY recently acquired the firm Ontegrate, which adds manufacturing advisory capabilities specifically in the area of linking manufacturing systems to the Internet of Things. Ontegrate also brings the capability of providing real-time, actionable analytics along the supply chain to improve efficiency and productivity in manufacturing production. On the consumer side, consultants seek to use IoT to analyze data to better understand consumers' shifting behavior for their clients and to create new strategies such as omni-channel sales and distribution approaches. For instance, CPG manufacturers are seeing consumers no longer shop at one local supermarket. They now shop across a wide variety of stores, including online and through smartphones, and they are much savvier in terms of requiring product customization and demanding greener wellness initiatives. Consultants are working with manufacturers to collaborate across the value chain with third parties and retailers by sharing data to create more targeted campaigns. More channels and collaborating with third parties inevitably means the sharing of data to gain a better understanding of how to reach consumers. The safeguarding of that data and the protection of all intellectual property of the CPG organization will be crucial, and seeking consulting in the area of cybersecurity to prevent breaches becomes a very high priority, which leads us to our last talking point, cybersecurity consulting. With advanced manufacturing technology comes the increased risk of cybersecurity threats. Manufacturing is the second most attacked industry only after healthcare. Consultants will work with clients to secure intellectual property and trade secrets and prevent breaches that can damage brand reputation and competitive advantage. As with healthcare cybersecurity consulting, this is not just an IT issue and must be an enterprise-wide top-down strategy, both in prevention and detection, awareness, and crisis management techniques. Consultants will be called in to educate their clients as trusted, authoritative experts on the subject and to bridge gaps where they exist. And Eric, I guess I'm going to throw it back to you.
Thank you, Laura. And I
Sure.
appreciate your wrapping things up there. So let's advance to the next slide. I think we've got some good questions that have come in, and I will be kind of doling those out to our team here. Why don't I start, Tomek, okay if I start with you? There's a good question posed about takeaways from Davos. Wondering if you might be willing to comment on that one.
That is a very interesting question. I guess my first reaction is that the watching the World Economic Forum Davos this year was a very sobering experience. It was a bizarre situation where China seemed to become the primary proponent of free markets around the world. I think the important takeaways, especially from the consulting perspective, are number one, something that we've already talked about that I certainly mentioned, but my colleagues also did in our presentations today, about the need to balance global and local, being able to take more into account local needs, local resource issues, local desires to capture greater revenues, to increase local employment, and to use more local resources. That's just going to be a factor going forward, and it's something that consultants are going to have to help global companies deal with. But I think there's another element that hasn't been discussed as much, and I think it's the need for better strategic communications, both as far as within companies themselves, of course, and there's a greater awareness of the need to bring stakeholders into important decisions. But I think the bigger issue is helping global companies, and by that I don't just mean the big, large brand name Fortune 500 global corporations, but as we all know, average middle-tier companies nowadays have complex supply chains that often stretch all over the world, even when they're only serving local, regional clients. So in that sense, helping these companies better articulate the advantages of these global value chains and the global model, both for their corporate clients, for consumers, and once it's going to take a long time for governments to figure out the tax and other regulatory elements of all this, but it's an advantage to countries in terms of employment, in terms of skill sets that are developed. So I think the message from Davos is really that consultants need to help clients balance it local with the global, and also help them to better communicate the advantages of the way they do business and how it benefits all these stakeholders and all these players. Go ahead, Eric, back to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Very good answer. Matt, I see a couple here that look like they might be well suited to you, and I'll let you take kind of dealer's choice on which one you'd like to start with. You see the questions that I'm referring to?
I do, Eric. Thank you. So I think the first question, and I'll be happy to answer both quickly. The first question is, are there Brexit opportunities for USA independent consultants and small firms? The short answer is yes. And I think that the opportunities that are going to exist for Brexit for the USA independent consultants and small firms is going to be similar to the advantages that small firms have in the United States, especially when operating within the public sector. In the U.S. public sector, we see preferential procurement treatment given to smaller companies, as there is a componency for small business, especially if they are woman or veteran or minority owned. Similar advantages also exist in the procurement process within the UK. And so there's organizational challenges, especially if you are a small firm or an independent firm, that help deal with some of the organizational challenges that the U.S. federal government dealt with as a result of recession, as a result of change in administration. These are great resume builders to place on a competitive proposal process, and also just the natural advantage that occurs from being a smaller firm or an independent contractor to having lower price points than obviously the multinational firms with significant resources and presence. Naturally, by extension, they are going to have a larger bottom line in their proposal process more often than not. So there is advantage there. I think the challenge that for any USA-based firm is really building that network. And I think that the advantage, or rather a strategy that can be used by some of the smaller firms that are US-centric, is to actually partner with some of these global firms. There are mentorship programs that a lot of the larger global firms, especially I'm thinking of the Big Four especially, but there are others, that are happy to take on small business simply by virtue of the fact it's a symbiotic relationship. The larger firms are able to gain access to competitive contracts that perhaps they would have been precluded from before. And then also, this is a way for the small firms to penetrate into the UK public sector market in this way, and then also have that mentorship relationship, have back-end access to the significant resources of the larger firms that are essentially sponsoring them. So that's the opportunity that I see as far as Brexit goes within the public sector, and there absolutely is opportunity there. And just very quickly, I'll address the second question, which is, wouldn't the same concerns about refugees and security be opportunities for consultants in the U.S. as well as Europe? Again, yes, I do believe so, but I think that the difference is in the severity of the migration crisis, of course, is going to have an impact on the sorts of services that are going to be offered. Obviously, while there have been refugees taken in the United States, it's not nearly to the magnitude that we see within the EU. And I think especially the opposite is true. We talked about in the first question about how U.S.-based firms with experience in transition and change in U.S. federal-based instances will have advantage bringing those skills to bear for Brexit. I think that any sort of security firm or any sort of even the small to mid-sized firms that have been working with the EU to manage the migration crisis, that have really built up their capability set with a much higher magnitude issue within the EU, will be a great selling point for the U.S. public sector if they were to pitch it to this administration. And obviously, this is a significant campaign promise of the Trump administration. It's a high focus area. This, of course, would be largely within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, but there's definitely going to be opportunity there, especially from an IT perspective as far as tracking and monitoring, and then also from a policy perspective as far as vetting is concerned and how to effectively vet. If there's a demonstration, an example from the EU from previous experiences for firms, that's going to be a really big boon for them in the competitive proposal process when competing for that sort of work within the U.S. Eric, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Matt. I think we've got a little bit more time. One more question. I'll try to get to one more question, and I'll state now, and I'll repeat this. But if we don't get a chance to answer your question during the session today, we will follow up directly with you via email. So we'll get to all of the questions here today, even if we don't get to them on the phone. I think there was a security-related question. Laura, I'm wondering if you're comfortable picking that one up.
Sure, yeah, I think it's a good question. Mike had asked about blockchain technology and whether we see it solving security issues in the next 5 years. The answer is yes, I think so. I think it will roll out. I like the fact that you said over the next 5 years, because I do think it will take some time to really become more mainstream. I'm recalling a conversation that I had recently with a consultant at Accenture, and I specifically was asking about sort of next level analytics and cognitive computing came up. And he said, you know, it all sounds really great, but in practice, most of us are just not quite there yet. So I do think that there are a lot of new things that are out there, and it's just going to take some time to incorporate them. But the capability of something like blockchain is going to be quite significant in terms of helping the cybersecurity prevention efforts.
Thank you, Laura. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. As we said at the outset, we expect this to be the first of several webinars like this on topics of interest to you. This is one that we got lots of inquiry around, whether it was around administrative change, around Brexit, or around what we saw as the impact of some of the cyber breach activity that we've seen in the news. So we wanted to kind of drill down into those areas today, but we expect to pick up future topics of interest to you all. We really rely on the marketplace to both inform us and to give us signals as to what we need to cover and what areas are really top of mind for both consulting firms and their clients. So you'll see on the next slide. We are here. We're anxious to talk to you and would love to get your point of view on anything you heard today, on anything you didn't hear today but you think we might have an opinion on, and we encourage you to reach out. And as I said, if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we will. Bear with us. The recording of our session will also be available soon. Thank you all for participating in the webinar this afternoon. We're grateful for your time, and we hope you'll continue to follow ALM Intelligence in future webinars like this. Have a wonderful afternoon.